The Republic thunders past with the rush of the express. Andrew Carnegie. At the start of the Gilded Age, many improvements were being made to try and better the quality of life and make day-to-day living easier. After the Civil War, factories started to serve peacetime purposes. Along with mines and mills, the ability to quickly produce products increased. The demand for better materials like iron, steel, coal, and lumber allowed for better improvements and an increase in new technology. The introduction of new technology was the catalyst that started many industrial changes. The biggest and probably most important was the expansion of the railroad. Railroads were right in the middle of the economic growth. Industrialization was on the rise due to the need to have a better quality of materials to expand railroads to the west. Along with railroads, streetcars and trolleys helped to expand city boundaries. These improvements to the transportation system helped link many diverse regions, and because better materials were being produced, better buildings and other structures were being made. One of these being the introduction of skyscrapers to the cityscape. Other new technologies like the telephone, typewriters, and light bulbs helped to reshape American life and make living easier. Many improvements were being made to increase safety, like the Westinghouse air brakes, which allowed the trains to travel safely at higher speeds. Along with technological improvements, many changes were made concerning entertainment. There was an increase in the number of magazines that were circulated. Commercialized entertainment was on the rise, especially in the sports of basketball, bicycling, and football. It was becoming common for cities to have saloons, theaters, and dance halls, and it wasn't uncommon for the wealthy to spend their time at the opera houses, theaters, and at lavish parties. One more positive aspect of urbanization was the education improvement. Citizens decided that for the government and society to properly function, an education was required. More high schools were added and compulsory attendance became mandatory. To help ensure kids were getting the best education, more teacher training schools were added. All of these improvements led to a decrease in illiteracy. It was easy to see all the good that came from the Gilded Age. However, things are rarely what they seem.
The Gilded Age was a time of economic growth and industrial revolution for America. Unfortunately, it was also a time of overpopulated cities, poor working conditions, and political machines. At the beginning of the urbanization period of the Gilded Age, many people from rural areas moved out to urban cities, where most immigrants were already settling. Unfortunately, because of everyone rushing into cities, they became overpopulated. The result was the development of the tenements and slums that continually decreased in size to help save space. A popular floor design for tenements at the time was the dumbbell design, in which an apartment was only 12 feet wide, and as many floor design for tenements at the time was the dumbbell design, in which an apartment was only 12 feet wide. As many as 3, sometimes 4 families were forced into these cramped quarters. Due to the overpopulation and crowding, many living areas were unsafe and unsanitary. They did not have clean air, effective ventilation, good drinking water, good lighting, or effective sewage, which contributed to the spread of bacteria and disease. Until the dumbbell system, which allowed a tenement building to have 4 air shafts, which were often ineffective, most apartments did not even have clean, breathable air. On top of the poor health and living conditions, there was no proper system of health care and no real benefits for workers. Railroad and industrial workers were often the brunt of the poor working conditions. There was no federal regulation of safety during the urbanization period and no real enforcement of state or local safety laws. So many people often got hurt, injured, and even died working in factories and on railroads. Fires, machinery accidents, and train wrecks were common in industry-linked jobs. Around the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, 25 to 35,000 deaths and 1 million injuries per year occurred in industrial fields of work. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to hold factory managers responsible for injuries and deaths because of limited laws. As a result of this, courts were generally not sympathetic towards worker claims. As far as actual workers go, many urbanization area factory workers were immigrants and children, flooding America looking for work and often took jobs building railroads or in factories. Children were also popular for the workforce and were sometimes taken out of school by their families and forced to work to help bring in money. Most factory workers were grossly underpaid and many were exploited, as there was no set guidelines on how workers were to be treated. Labor unions and other political machines arose and gained control of American politics because of poor working conditions. These political machines were organizations formed by politicians and run by bosses who controlled government jobs and ballots through loyalty and corruption. Political machines would often provide dreadful neighborhoods with new railroads and other amenities, providing the poor with immediate relief, which is what sent many flocking to them, giving the machines support and allowing them to keep control. One of the biggest political machines was the Boss Tweed Ring, led by William Meager Tweed. The organization was based out of Tammany Hall and had absolute power over who would be nominated as the Democratic candidate for president. Tweed stole between $75 million and $200 million from the government and the people during his reign. All in all, urbanization and the Gilded Age had some very ugly effects on the American people as well as the American government.
During the Gilded Age, new philosophies and belief systems were abound. And with these new beliefs came new social systems. The Puritan work ethic, however, was an old one. Puritan work ethic was a belief that hard work demonstrated character and closeness to God. This belief was primarily practiced by the lower classes and helped them through their difficult tasks. In contrast, social Darwinism is the belief that only the strong deserve to be in control, by extension, survive in a harsh world. Social Darwinism was most noticeably used by the upper class and used to justify their control and position. Horatio Alger, a noted author, was famous for his support of social Darwinism in order to maintain the economic growth that was the Gilded Age. With these new philosophies, new movements began in order to help the lower classes. For example, the YMCA and its successors offered sleeping quarters, hot baths, and Sabbath services to poor workers. The Children's Aid Society was opened with the intent to offer better life to poor, homeless, and orphan children. And finally, the Salvation Army was created to share the gospel with the poor and miserable.
The Gilded Age was an era of innovation. Every innovation made was seen by the public, and every innovation elicited a reaction that was sure to be different across the public. The filling in of Back Bay could be considered a prerequisite to the city beautification movement because Back Bay in 1858 was seen as a health hazard. The land they filled doubled the size of the Boston Peninsula. This new land gave way to parks and illustrated the importance of Boston as a bustling waterfront. The city beautification movement began around 1893 and emerged as a way for the middle and upper classes to deal with urban problems like disease, crime, and pollution. It was the effect of an increase of immigrants moving into the U.S. that this occurred. While overall it was a philosophical movement to instill moral virtue into urban populations, many people have criticized that it was overly concerned with aesthetics at the expense of social reform. Frederick Law Olmsted, known for design of public parks, Frederick Law Olmsted was the father of landscape architecture because of his multiple co-designs of public parks, like Central Park in New York City. His architecture set a high standard that continues to influence landscape architecture to this day. The Gilded Age is known for many fathers, like Louis Sullivan, the father of skyscrapers. Known for many designs, like the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, New York, Sullivan came from an age that saw new steel used that allowed for buildings to be built taller because of the steel frame that took away the stress from the lower levels. While his legacy as the father of skyscrapers is controversial, since he was not the first to build them, his ornamental ironwork is still used and liked today and has inspired many of today's great architects. The Gilded Age is the beginning of the society we are used to today. Most inventions created back then are the grandfathers for technology we use now. The urbanization of the Gilded Age is still in effect today, while we still use the buildings and parks. The philosophies are still being used and acted upon, and even though some may have decayed, they have rightfully earned their place in the history of the Gilded Age.